The wind moved across the prairie like a restless animal that refused to sleep, and the young settler woman ran through it, with her shawl clutched tight around her shoulders, as if the thin wool could somehow protect her from the life she had just abandoned behind her in the darkness of the valley road. Her name had been spoken all evening at the supper table, not with affection, but with calculation, the way farmers discussed cattle or land prices. And every time her father said it, she felt the invisible rope of fate tightening around her throat, because the man waiting to marry her was rich, old, and permanently soaked in whiskey. She had seen him once earlier that afternoon, when he arrived in a rattling wagon with mud on the wheels and arrogance in his crooked smile, his beard yellowed by tobacco, his breath thick with liquor, and the way his cloudy eyes measured her from head to toe like he was inspecting livestock had made something inside her shrink with cold dread. She heard the bargain after sunset when the men believed she was asleep behind the thin plank wall of the cabin, her father speaking slowly about money, land, and debts, her mother crying quietly but never once saying the word no, and the old man laughing in a wet, slurred voice that promised a wedding before winter ended. That was the moment the girl understood the truth. She was not being married, she was being traded. Something fierce and trembling rose inside her chest like a bird beating its wings against a cage. She packed nothing but a small cloth bundle with a change of clothes and the faded photograph of her parents from a time before poverty hardened their faces. Then she waited until the house sank into the slow, breathing silence of sleep and slipped barefoot through the back door into the night. Now hours later the prairie stretched endless around her, a silver ocean of frost grass under the moon. Coyotes called somewhere far away, their thin voices floating across the dark like warnings meant for travelers who did not belong on the open land. Her feet burned from the frozen ground, yet she forced herself forward step after step, because turning back meant returning to that drunken smile and a lifetime of silence. The wind strengthened as midnight deepened, carrying the smell of distant cattle barns and wood smoke, and she wondered if somewhere ahead there might still exist a door she could knock on without fear. Minutes stretched into aching miles, her breathing ragged, her fingers numb, but stubborn hope kept her moving until at last something changed in the darkness. At first she thought it was another trick of moonlight, but then she saw it again, a dim golden glow trembling low against the horizon like a star that had fallen to earth. The sight slowed her steps because light meant people, and people meant questions. Yet the cold pressed deeper into her bones and the glow promised warmth, shelter, perhaps even mercy, so she walked toward it with careful, uncertain determination. The land dipped gently, and as she climbed the next rise the shape of a ranch slowly emerged from shadow. A low wooden cabin, a wide barn, fences stitched across the fields, and several lanterns glowing along the porch rail like patient, watchful eyes. She knew the place only by rumor. Travelers sometimes mentioned a rancher who lived there alone, a tall, quiet man with strength enough to break wild horses but little interest in towns or company. Some said he was dangerous. Others said he was the most honest soul in the valley. Tonight she had no choice but to discover which story was true. Her legs trembled as she reached the wooden gate and slipped through into the yard where the smell of horses, hay, and leather hung warm in the air. The cabin door stood dark beneath the lanterns, and for a long moment she simply stared at it, because once she knocked the path behind her would truly vanish forever. Her hand rose slowly, hovered in the lamplight, then fell back to her side, fear whispering that strangers could be cruel. Yet the wind cut through her thin dress, and the memory of that drunken laugh returned sharper than ice. She lifted her hand again and knocked once softly. The sound seemed too small for such a desperate request, so she knocked again harder. Silence filled the yard, stretching so long she feared no one lived there after all. Then heavy footsteps crossed the cabin floor and the door opened. A man stood framed in lantern light, tall, broad-shouldered, bare-chested, with long dark curls falling around a weathered face that held both strength and watchful restraint. For a heartbeat neither of them spoke. The rancher studied the trembling girl, the dust on her hem, the exhaustion in her eyes, and the quiet desperation she could not hide. Finally she whispered the only truth she had left. "Please, I just need somewhere safe tonight." Something shifted behind the rancher's steady gaze, not suspicion, not curiosity, but a sudden understanding that arrived without questions. He stepped past her onto the porch, and instead of answering he reached for the nearest lantern. One by one he moved across the yard, lighting every lamp hanging from posts, fences, and stable doors until the ranch glowed like a small island of fire in the vast sleeping prairie. The girl watched, confused and trembling, as warm light spread across the ground, chasing darkness from every corner. When he finally returned to the doorway, his voice was quiet but certain, carrying the calm authority of a man who meant every word he spoke. "Come inside," he said softly. "You're safe here." The lanterns flickered gently around them, and for the first time since leaving home, the girl felt the crushing weight of fear loosen slightly. Yet safety was fragile for someone who had spent the entire night running from betrayal, and she lingered on the threshold as though crossing it might break a spell. The rancher seemed to sense the hesitation because he stepped aside without urgency, giving her space rather than pressure. The warm glow behind him revealed the interior of the cabin, a stone hearth burning steady, shelves lined with worn books, a wooden table by years of honest work, and the quiet order of a life lived simply but with care. She stepped forward at last, the floorboards creaking beneath her chilled feet, and the door closed gently behind her, sealing the wind outside like a distant storm. The rancher moved to the hearth, lifted an iron kettle, and poured steaming water into a tin cup before offering it to her with the steady patience of someone accustomed to quiet nights. She wrapped both hands around the cup, letting the heat seep slowly into her numb fingers while studying the man who had answered her knock. Up close he seemed even larger, his shoulders broad from years of ranch work, his skin marked by sun, wind, and small scars that spoke of hard seasons. Yet his eyes held a quiet steadiness that made the room feel strangely calm. He asked only one question, his voice low and careful. "Is someone chasing you?" The girl hesitated because speaking the truth meant admitting how close she had come to losing her freedom forever. But something about the lantern light outside the door, the quiet fire, and the patience in his posture loosened the tight knot in her chest. "My father promised me to a man," she said slowly, "a rich one but drunk, older than my father himself." The rancher's jaw tightened slightly, though he said nothing at first. He simply listened while she continued, the words tumbling out faster now because they had been trapped inside her all evening. "They said the wedding would happen soon," she whispered, "and I knew if I stayed I would never belong to myself again." Silence followed, thick but thoughtful rather than judgmental. The rancher stared into the flames for a long moment, as if measuring the weight of what she had said. Finally, he spoke with quiet certainty. "No woman should be traded like cattle." The words were simple, yet the conviction behind them felt stronger than anger. Outside, the lanterns swayed softly in the night wind, sending slow halos of gold across the windows. She realized then that he had not lit them for decoration, but as a signal to anyone passing in darkness that this place held light and perhaps protection. She swallowed hard, realizing how close she had come to wandering past it without the courage to knock. "Thank you," she murmured, though the words felt far too small for the shelter she had been given. The rancher shook his head slightly as if gratitude was unnecessary. "A storm like this," he said, nodding toward the dark prairie outside, "no one should face it alone." His words settled over her like another blanket, warm and steady and unexpectedly kind. Yet somewhere beyond the glowing circle of lantern light, the world she had fled still existed, her father, the drunken suitor, the bargain that might not be forgotten. As the fire cracked softly in the hearth, she wondered whether the men she had escaped would eventually follow the same faint trail she had left across the prairie. The rancher seemed to sense that lingering fear because he rose quietly and walked to the window where lantern light spilled across the yard. He studied the horizon a long moment before speaking again. "If anyone comes looking tonight," he said calmly, "they'll see those lanterns first, and they'll know this house isn't empty." The girl followed his gaze through the glass where the lamps burned steadily against the dark sea of prairie grass. In that quiet moment, she understood that the lights were more than lanterns. They were a promise, a warning, and perhaps the beginning of something neither of them yet fully understood. Outside, the wind carried a distant rhythm that might have been hoofbeats or only the echo of her imagination, but the sound made her heart pause halfway through a breath. The rancher heard it too, because his shoulders stiffened slightly before he reached for another lantern near the door and lifted it high. He glanced back at the frightened girl standing beside the hearth, his voice lowering to a quiet promise. "Stay near the fire," he said gently. "Tonight the lanterns burn for you." And as the wind swept across the prairie again, carrying that faint, uncertain rhythm through the darkness, she realized the desperate knock she had made might have awakened more than a single door, because somewhere beyond the lantern light, the past she fled could already be riding toward this quiet ranch, guided by the very lights meant to keep her safe. The wind scraped across the prairie like a rough hand against dry leather, and the lantern the rancher held by the door swayed gently in his grip as he listened to the faint rhythm drifting through the darkness beyond the fence line. The girl remained beside the hearth where he had asked her to stay, the firelight painting her face in restless shadows, while her heart pounded against her ribs with the stubborn fear that the life she had fled was already catching up to her. For several long seconds, neither of them spoke. The rancher stood still as a fence post, the lantern lifted slightly, his eyes scanning the dark fields with the careful patience of a man who had spent most of his life reading the land. The sound came again, faint, uneven, almost swallowed by the wind. Hoofbeats. Not many, perhaps 2 horses, maybe 3, somewhere beyond the hills. The girl felt the warmth drain from her fingers. They found me, she whispered. The rancher lowered the lantern slowly and closed the door with calm precision. The heavy wood settled into its frame with a quiet thud that somehow sounded stronger than a lock. When he turned back toward her, his expression held no panic, only the steady focus of someone accustomed to trouble arriving without invitation. Maybe, he said simply. He crossed the room in 2 long steps and set the lantern beside the others hanging near the door. The glow in the cabin deepened, filling every corner with warm gold, and the girl realized that the man had arranged the lights carefully so that darkness had nowhere to hide. She tightened the shawl around her shoulders, her voice barely steady. If it's my father, he won't leave without me. The rancher studied her for a moment as if weighing the truth in those words. Then he walked toward the hearth, rested one hand against the rough stone mantel, and stared thoughtfully into the flames. Did you choose to leave? He asked. The question surprised her. Yes. Did anyone force you to run? No. The rancher nodded slowly, the firelight catching the lines of his face, and when he looked back at her, his voice carried quiet certainty. Then nobody has the right to drag you anywhere. The words settled into the room with the weight of iron. Outside, the wind rattled the fence posts and stirred the lantern flames so they danced against the windows like restless stars. The hoofbeats grew slightly louder, then faded again as if the riders were circling somewhere far beyond the ranch. The girl sank slowly onto the wooden bench beside the hearth, exhaustion finally pressing down on her shoulders. Her legs trembled from the long night's journey and the fear she had carried with every step. The rancher seemed to notice the way her body swayed because he moved toward a cupboard, opened it, and brought out a small loaf of bread along with a bowl of thick stew left from earlier in the evening. He placed the bowl on the table and gestured toward it. Wait. She hesitated at first, embarrassed by how hungry she felt, but the smell of warm broth rose into the air and her body surrendered to its need. She sat at the table and took a careful spoonful while the rancher leaned quietly against the wall nearby, watching the door as if expecting it to move at any moment. After several minutes, the trembling in her hands eased slightly. The warmth of the food spread through her chest, softening the sharp edge of fear that had followed her across the prairie. You live here alone? She asked. The rancher nodded once. Have for years. No family. Not anymore. He said the words without bitterness, yet something in his tone suggested a silence deeper than simple loneliness. The girl lowered her eyes, realizing she had stepped too close to a memory he preferred not to share. I'm sorry, she said quietly. He shrugged gently. Life on the prairie takes people sometimes. The answer held no further explanation, but it told her enough. This man understood loss in the same quiet way he understood storms and wandering cattle, things that arrived without warning and had to be endured. Outside, the wind shifted again. The hoofbeats returned, louder this time. The rancher pushed himself away from the wall and walked to the window, parting the curtain just enough to see the yard. The lanterns burned steadily along the porch and fence posts, throwing long golden shadows across the ground. For a moment, nothing moved beyond the gate. Then 2 shapes appeared on the distant road. Riders. The girl rose halfway from the bench, panic tightening her voice. It's them. The rancher watched quietly as the figures approached through the dim light. The riders moved slowly, their horses' breath visible in the cold air. When they reached the gate, they stopped. One of them leaned forward in the saddle and shouted, Girl, we knowed you're here. The voice carried across the yard like a cracked whip. The girl's stomach twisted instantly because she recognized the slurred anger of the drunken man who had expected to marry her. Even from inside the cabin, she could hear the bitterness behind his words. You come out now and we'll take you home proper, the man shouted again. The rancher let the curtain fall back into place and turned toward her. Is that him? She nodded slowly. And the other? My father. For a moment the rancher said nothing. Then he reached for a lantern hanging beside the door and lifted it from its hook. The flame inside flickered brighter as he stepped onto the porch. The girl's breath caught in her throat. "You don't have to face them," she whispered urgently. He glanced back at her over his shoulder, calm as ever. "They're already here." The door opened and cold wind rushed briefly into the cabin before closing behind him. From the window, the girl watched the rancher walk slowly across the yard until the lantern light revealed his tall silhouette against the fence. His bare chest caught the glow, muscles shifting beneath weathered skin as he planted his boots firmly in the dirt. The riders stared at him from their horses. "Where's the girl?" the drunken man demanded immediately. The rancher held the lantern higher, letting its light spread across the yard so every movement could be seen clearly. His voice remained quiet but carried easily through the night air. "She's inside." "Then send her out," the man barked. "She belongs with us." The rancher tilted his head slightly, as though considering the statement. "Does she?" The girl pressed her hand against the glass, unable to look away. Her father shifted uneasily in the saddle beside the drunken suitor, his face half hidden beneath his hat. "We have an agreement," the old man continued loudly. "Her father gave his word." The rancher's gaze moved slowly from one rider to the other. "I didn't hear her give hers." The silence that followed felt heavy enough to bend the fence posts. The drunken man laughed harshly. "Since when does a girl decide her own future?" The rancher took one calm step closer to the gate. "Since she ran all night to avoid yours." The girl's breath caught again, this time with something unfamiliar rising inside her chest. The old man's expression darkened. "You think you're protecting her," he sneered. "She's nothing but a stubborn child." The rancher's voice remained steady. "She's a person." The drunken rider shifted angrily in the saddle, his horse stamping the ground. "This doesn't concern you," he growled. The rancher lifted the lantern slightly higher, its glow illuminating his face with quiet authority. "It concerns me if trouble comes to my door." For a long moment, the wind was the only sound in the yard. Then the girl saw her father finally speak. "She's my daughter," he said tiredly, "and we need the money." The words struck harder than the shouting had. Inside the cabin, the girl felt tears burn behind her eyes, yet she forced herself not to look away from the window. The rancher studied the older man carefully. "Money isn't worth her life," he said. The father looked down at his reins, unable to answer. But the drunken suitor had no such hesitation. "I paid for her," he snapped. "Now move aside." The rancher's shoulders straightened slightly. "No." The single word fell into the night like a stone dropped in deep water. The horseman leaned forward in the saddle, his temper boiling over. "You think I won't come take her myself?" The rancher didn't move. "You can try." For a moment it seemed the man might actually ride forward through the gate, but the steady lantern light and the rancher's unshaken stance created an invisible barrier stronger than wood or wire. The drunken rider spat into the dust. "This isn't finished," he muttered. He jerked the reins sharply and turned his horse toward the road. The girl's father hesitated 1 second longer before following, his shoulders sagging beneath the weight of choices he could not undo. The hoofbeats faded slowly back into the prairie night. The rancher remained at the gate long after the riders disappeared beyond the hills, the lantern still glowing in his hand. Only when silence returned completely did he walk back toward the porch. Inside the cabin, the girl stepped away from the window as the door opened again. He hung the lantern on its hook and closed the door quietly behind him. "They won't come back tonight," he said. She stared at him, overwhelmed by the calm strength that had pushed away the men who believed they owned her future. "Why did you help me?" she asked softly. The rancher paused beside the table, considering the question carefully before answering. "Because someone should have done it sooner." The fire crackled gently in the hearth, its warmth filling the space between them. For the first time since leaving home, the girl felt something deeper than relief begin to grow in her chest, a fragile sense of belonging she had never known before. Outside, the lanterns continued burning across the yard, like quiet guardians against the dark prairie. The rancher moved toward the window again, glancing once more toward the distant hills where the riders had vanished. Then he spoke without turning around. They might come back tomorrow. The girl felt her heart tighten again. And if they do? The rancher rested his hand against the window frame, watching the lantern light ripple across the empty fields. Then tomorrow, he said calmly, we make sure they understand something they didn't tonight. He turned slightly, his steady eyes meeting hers across the glow of the fire. That you're not alone here anymore. Morning arrived slowly across the prairie, the pale light of dawn spilling over the frost-tipped grass like quiet forgiveness after a long and restless night. The girl woke beside the hearth where the last embers glowed faintly red, her body wrapped in a wool blanket the rancher must have placed over her while she slept. For a moment she lay still, unsure whether the safety she remembered from the night before had been real or only a fragile dream. Then she heard the distant creak of the barn doors and the low breath of horses greeting the morning, and she understood she was still here, inside the lantern-lit ranch that had become her refuge. She rose slowly, her muscles stiff from exhaustion, and stepped toward the window. Outside the yard shimmered beneath early sunlight, and the lanterns that had burned through the night still hung along the fence posts, their flames now pale against the growing day. The sight stirred something warm inside her chest, because those small lights had marked the place where her desperate journey ended and another life began. The rancher stood near the barn with a bucket of grain balanced in one hand, his tall figure moving with the quiet rhythm of someone long accustomed to the work of mourning. His curls fell loosely around his shoulders, and though the air still held winter's chill, he seemed untouched by the cold, his broad frame steady and strong as he moved among the horses. For a moment she simply watched him, remembering the way he had stood against the gate the night before, unshaken by the men who had come to claim her future. No one had ever defended her like that before. She stepped outside carefully, the wooden porch cool beneath her bare feet. The rancher looked up from the barn doorway when he heard the creak of the boards and gave a brief nod of greeting. "Morning," he said. His voice carried the calm simplicity of someone who measured the world by work rather than words. "Morning," she replied softly. The wind moved gently across the fields, stirring the grass in slow silver waves. She wrapped the blanket around her shoulders and walked toward the barn where the rancher continued feeding the horses. "They're gone," she said quietly, glancing toward the distant road where her father and the drunken suitor had disappeared hours earlier. "For now," he answered. The words held no fear, only awareness. She hesitated beside the barn door. "I don't want to bring trouble here." The rancher poured the last of the grain into the trough and brushed dust from his hands before meeting her gaze. "Trouble already came," he said simply. "You didn't invite it." The truth in that statement eased a tension she hadn't realized she carried. Still, uncertainty lingered like a shadow at the edge of her thoughts. "What happens now?" she asked. The rancher leaned against the wooden post beside the stall, considering the question with quiet patience. "Now," he said slowly, "you decide what you want your life to be." The words felt unfamiliar, almost unreal. No one had ever offered her that kind of freedom before. Her choices had always belonged to someone else, her father, the expectations of neighbors, the unspoken rules that bound women to obedience. She looked across the ranch, at the wide fields stretching toward the horizon, at the quiet barn and the steady smoke rising from the cabin chimney. "I've never decided anything for myself," she admitted. The rancher gave a small, thoughtful smile. "Then maybe it's time you start." The morning passed slowly after that. She helped carry water from the well and sweep the cabin floor while the rancher repaired a section of fence near the pasture. Their conversation remained simple and scattered, yet a quiet ease grew between them with each shared task. By afternoon, the sun had climbed high enough to soften the frost, and the prairie smelled of thawing earth. She stood beside the corral, watching the rancher guide a young horse in slow circles, his movements firm but gentle, and she realized she had begun to feel something she hadn't felt in years. Basil. But peace rarely lasted long on the frontier. The distant rumble of hooves returned before sunset. This time there were more riders. She heard them before she saw them, the thunder of horses breaking the quiet afternoon like a gathering storm. Her heart leapt into her throat as she turned toward the road, and within moments a line of figures appeared on the horizon. Her father rode at the front. Beside him was the drunken suitor, his posture stiff with anger. Behind them rode 4 other men she did not recognize. The rancher saw them too. He stepped away from the corral and wiped his hands on a cloth, his expression calm though his eyes sharpened slightly. "They brought friends," she said, her voice trembling. The rancher studied the approaching riders for a long moment before speaking. "Stay inside." But she shook her head. "No." He looked at her, surprised by the quiet determination in her voice. "I ran all night because I was afraid," she continued. "I don't want to hide anymore." The rancher's gaze lingered on her face, as if measuring the strength behind those words. Then he nodded once. "All right." Together they walked toward the front gate. The lanterns that had burned the previous night still hung along the fence posts, unlit but waiting. The rancher reached out and struck a match against the wood, lighting the first lantern with steady hands. Flame bloomed softly behind the glass. Then he lit the next one. And the next. The girl realized what he was doing. He was lighting every lantern again. By the time the riders reached the gate, the yard glowed with warm gold light, despite the fatting afternoon sun. The drunken suitor pulled his horse to a stop and laughed bitterly when he saw the two figures standing together beneath the lanterns. "You think a few lamps will scare us," he sneered. The rancher rested his hand on the wooden gate, his voice quiet but firm. "They're not for scaring anyone." "Then what are they for?" The rancher glanced briefly at the girl beside him before answering. "So she remembers she's not alone." The men behind the drunken suitor shifted uneasily in their saddles. Her father avoided her eyes. "Daughter," he muttered finally, "this has gone far enough." She stepped forward, her heart racing yet her voice steady. "I'm not going back." The drunken man's face twisted with fury. "You belong to me," he snapped. The rancher's posture changed slightly then, the quiet calm hardening into something immovable. "No," he said. The single word carried the weight of a locked door. The drunken rider swung one leg over his saddle, as if preparing to dismount. "You don't understand," he growled. "I paid for her." The rancher opened the gate slowly and stepped through, placing himself between the riders and the girl. "She's not for sale." For a moment, no one moved. Then one of the men behind the suitor nudged his horse forward, clearly expecting the rancher to step aside. But he didn't. The lantern light reflected in his eyes as he stood there, tall and unyielding, a man who had spent his life building something honest in a hard land. The girl felt a sudden surge of courage rise within her chest. She stepped beside him. "I chose to stay," she said loudly. The wind carried her words across the yard like a challenge. The drunken man hesitated, his anger colliding with the quiet certainty in her voice and the silent strength of the rancher beside her. Behind him, the other riders exchanged uneasy glances. One of them finally muttered, "This ain't worth the trouble." Another nodded. The suitor realized too late that the moment of intimidation had slipped from his grasp. He cursed under his breath and jerked his horse's reins sharply. "This isn't finished," he warned. Then he turned and rode away. One by one, the other riders followed, leaving only the girl's father lingering at the gate. For a long moment, he stared at his daughter with a mixture of regret and stubborn pride. "You've made your choice," he said quietly. "Yes," she answered. He nodded slowly, then turned his horse toward the fatting light of the prairie without another word. The sound of hoofbeats faded into the distance once more. Silence returned to the ranch. The girl stood there breathing slowly as the last trace of fear drifted away with the riders. The rancher closed the gate and turned toward her. The lanterns flickered gently around them as evening settled across the fields. "Well," he said after a moment, "looks like the storm passed." She smiled faintly. "Maybe." They stood together in the quiet glow of the lights that had once guided her through the darkest night of her life. Finally, she looked at him and asked softly, "Why did you light every lantern again?" The rancher glanced across the yard, where the warm flames burned steadily against the growing dusk. "So the place would feel like home," he said. The words settled between them like a promise waiting to be spoken. Months later, when spring painted the prairie green and the wind carried the smell of wildflowers instead of frost, the rancher lit every lantern once more beneath a sky full of stars. But this time the girl stood beside him on the porch, her hand resting gently in his as the lights of the ranch glowed across the quiet fields that had become their shared future.